So let's go ahead and get started. Welcome, one and all, to our panel, What Can a Liberal Arts Education Offer in the Age of Trump? I'm Paul Steinberg, Chair of the Department of Humanities, Social Sciences, and the Arts here at Harvey Mudd College, and I'm joined by a number of colleagues whom I'll introduce in a moment. Many of you know. This event is being recorded. We'll post it on the website for the department after the event. There'll be an opportunity for Q&A. If you want to be recorded, let me know. We'll pull it out and get it. No problem. Okay? People, my comments out here as well. So this panel is born of the idea that during historical moments when the world gets really weird and crazy and frightening and divided and angry and violent and hurt, that we as individuals and as an organization like Harvey Mudd College, we face a choice. And one sort of pathway in this choice is this kind of depression, individually and collectively, that I think all of us have experienced. Psychologists will tell you that anxiety, often depression, is a response to anxiety. It's a way to sort of calm things down. This sort of inward pulling, self-censorship, don't speak, might say the wrong thing, mistrust, and kind of escape to the dogma of bumper sticker politics and the vocabulary of otherness. And ultimately, it leads to a kind of numbing collective depression as we become so tired of it all that we just retreat. Right? Keep our heads down, do your problem sets, watch Game of Thrones. The other path is a reassertion and a rejuvenation of our best instincts at a university like this one. Questioning and research and dialogue and collaboration and an open and respectful exchange of ideas and crucially action. Recognizing that universities, places like the Claremont colleges, are not just sort of compatible with democracy and social justice. Historically, these have been the lifeblood of democracy and social justice in societies around the world, including our own, and especially during uncertain times. And so today, we thought, well, how might we tap this sort of richness, this sort of possibly large and growing collection of ideas that universities continue to assert even during times when it's tempting to retreat. How might we tap that? And so we thought we would have this event to make sense of what we're calling the era of Trump, and whatever that term means for you all. And so today we'll dip a bucket, well, they only have 7 minutes each, so maybe a ladle, into a few wells with short talks by 6 speakers. And then in the best democratic tradition, recognizing that we do not have a monopoly of truth on this side of the room, we'll open it up for discussion to hear your questions and ideas. So let me introduce the speakers all as a group, and then we'll go in order after that. We have Ambereen Dadabhoy, Professor of Literature, and Vivien Hamilton, Professor of Science, Technology, and Society. Debra Mashek, who's a Professor of Social Psychology. Salvador Pascencia, Professor of Creative Writing. And David Seitz, Professor of Cultural Geography. And then I'll speak last, sharing some thoughts from political science. So, with that, let me turn it over to Ambereen.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you all for coming. My talk today is called Why We Need a Trump Shakespeare. I will begin with a straightforward contention. This is a contention not mine, but Margaret Garber's, and I agree with it. So the contention is, literature is good to think with. It makes us better analysts, better interpreters, better readers. It doesn't supply answers. This will seem like a contradiction, that we acquire various critical thinking skills, yet we don't utilize them in the service of solutions. Moreover, this might appear problematic, given that I will try to supply some semblance of an answer to what I see as a critical moment of conjunction between the realms of literature and politics. When a production of a 400-year-old play created a political firestorm, which resulted not in our revisiting that literary work, but in refusing nuanced close reading in order to buttress ideological positioning. This moment suggests to me the problem of doing art, of doing Shakespeare, in a polarized political milieu. What I hope to model in the few minutes I have is why we need to think the way literary scholars and humanists think, because those methodologies will make us better navigators of our social and political culture. Allow me to set the scene. This summer, the Public Theater in New York staged a production of Julius Caesar in which the character of Caesar was uncannily similar to our nation's 45th president. Ill-fitting suit, too long red tie, and a suspiciously coiffed copper head of hair included. While this wasn't the first instance of Shakespeare colliding with Donald Trump, many newspaper articles over the summer pointed out the Shakespearean nature of our 2016 election. The production's overt analog to our divided political moment drew criticism from right-wing media and eventually from the play's corporate sponsors because of events in the plot. Spoiler alert, if you don't know Julius Caesar is murdered in the Senate. The regicide, combined with the setting and characterization of the production, suggested to those who objected to the play that it was advocating assassination. That, of course, is asinine to anyone who has bothered to dust off their copies of Shakespeare's play. Even a cursory reading of the play revealed that Caesar's murder instigates the end of Republican Rome. The very way of life that the conspirators sought to preserve through their violent act was decimated by the regicide. Why then were people up in arms about this production? Was it disrespectful to the office of the presidency of the United States? If so, wouldn't a 2012 Obama-esque production of Julius Caesar at the Guthrie Theater also have raised eyebrows and caused a political firestorm? It didn't, by the way. The Trump Caesar production was taken as a liberal attack on a conservative president. What was used as evidence was the setting and costume design. What was obviously not used as evidence was the actual text that was being performed. Let me make 2 points of clarification here. From my understanding of the production, as someone who didn't see it, but read much of the commentary and reviews, is that it was deliberately provocative, as art should be. I think we were meant to see it as a distorted reflection of our political culture. And I think that was its failing, because Shakespeare's work is not in the business of providing easy answers to pressing questions about political agency and legitimacy. The Shakespearean corpus features many plays concerned with bad or weak rulers. 2 that easily come to mind are my favorite play, Richard II, and my least favorite play, King Lear. Either one of those plays might have been appropriate to show a boorish ruler who was more interested in the empty words and promises of flatterers than he was in the proper rule and stewardship of his people and country. Julius Caesar is a different play, because Caesar is flattered precisely once to his detriment in the play. He's persuaded into going to the Senate over the objections of his wife by one of the conspirators. And that is a deadly persuasion. Other than that, Caesar's only crime, as both Brutus and Antony remind their interlocutors, is his ambition. Thus, the tidy mapping with the Public Theater and even those conservatives who objected to the play saw in Julius Caesar is about the intents and effects of the powerful spectacle of regicide. For the Public Theater, this was perhaps a way to use the machinery of the theater to exercise the spirit of an unwanted leader, a symbolic burning of Trump's effigy. For conservatives, it was the same event, but read as a real or potential threat to the president, and very certainly a lack of respect for the man. What both miss are the politics that the Shakespearean text is intent on interrogating and delivering. In the few minutes I have left, I want to focus on those politics and how spectacle is mobilized to serve political ends. We cannot deny the power of Act 3, Scene 1, when Caesar is surrounded by the conspirators and ritually stabbed to death. If we know the play, we might remember Caesar's famous line, et tu, Brute, in response to his beloved friend Brutus wielding the killing blow. What we might have forgotten is the bloody business that follows the murder, the bathing of the conspirators' hands and their swords in Caesar's blood. That they walk forth to the marketplace waving their red weapons, crying peace, freedom, and liberty. Caesar's blood here is both a sign of his death and a symbol of their triumph, of Roman republicanism over potential tyranny. Once shed, however, Caesar's blood circulates through the body politic of the Republic, animating those who will take up his side and staunching the support garnered by the conspirators. coupled with Caesar's corpse, Antony's rousing rhetoric. I'm sure we all remember from sophomore English class, friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears, which I had to memorize, and I still remember the whole speech. The Roman populace soon turns on their would-be saviors. Indeed, what Shakespeare delivers here via one of his most famous stage properties, Caesar's cooling corpse, is a very deep suspicion, not only of the flighty Roman mob, but also of rhetoric and of spectacle, of language and of image, of optics and of messaging. What Brutus fails to understand, but Shakespeare, a man of the theater, understands too well, is that political power is theatrical in its very nature. While Brutus may proclaim the justice of his cause, Antony, political animal that he becomes in the latter half of the play, produces not just stirring words, but also Caesar's brutalized and bloody corpse. Where Shakespeare gives Brutus dull prose, he allows Antony's words to move the populace in emotional iambic pentameter. Where Brutus tells the Roman populace to take his word for it that Caesar really had to die, Antony produces Caesar's will, exhibiting to those same Romans that they are Caesar's unworthy heirs. The victors in the battle for Rome are not those who fight on the side of honor and on the side of Roman values, but rather those who can and do control the narrative of Caesar's murder. Optics, messaging, controlling the narrative, these are words that we cannot escape from in our politically saturated climate. So what does a 400-year-old play have to teach us about such things? A lot, apparently. This is the reason we turn to Shakespeare as a culture for answers in our turbulent times. In his work, we read the tea leaves of our conflicted and divided moment. Much of this has to do with his ubiquity and perceived universality, and we can talk about that later. But much of it has to do with the uneasy, difficult, and dangerous politics he didn't shy away from in his work, and his unwillingness to tell us what we should think. That's why we need literature, and that's why we need a Trump Shakespeare. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambereen. And I want to take personal responsibility for those noisy plastics. If you have any noise to make with the plastic wrappers, please make it now. Wrap things and take them out and so forth. You can minimize that during the presentation, so it'll help with the recording. Now that we have wrapped your attention to this particular announcement, I should also note that, apologies to the music program, there's no food allowed in this room. Who knew? So please be sure to pick everything up. All right, with that, sorry, Bill. With that, let's turn to our next speaker, Vivien Hamilton.
Thank you. So I didn't give my talk a title, but it's about ignorance. So last September, if you visited the main homepage for the United States Environmental Protection Agency, you could explore a list of environmental topics, starting from a prominent drop-down menu. Topics such as air, mold, lead, pesticides, and climate change. If you go to the same page today and you click on the same menu bar, everything looks identical, but climate change is gone. One day last spring, all of the material on the main pages for the EPA on climate change disappeared. Some of the information is now buried deep in the archive of the site, and some of it's just gone. So, as a historian of science, what do I make of this? In history of science, we usually study the production of knowledge. So if you take a class with me, we might read Darwin, try and figure out how he came up with natural selection, how important were his observations of finches in the Galapagos. What about his reading of economic theorists like Malthus? Or we might think about the role that thought experiments played for Einstein as he was coming up with special relativity. These are all questions about the creation of knowledge. What do we do as we watch knowledge being erased? Recently, some scholars in my field have asked us to start paying more attention, not to knowledge, but to ignorance. Instead of focusing solely on questions of epistemology, what we know, how we know it, and why, we can also study agnotology, or the production of ignorance. And I think this can be quite a powerful and important project. As we look to history for examples, we can see that ignorance is more than simply not knowing. We enable ignorance in multiple ways. And understanding what we're seeing unfolding before us, I think, is the first step towards effective resistance. Sometimes ignorance is the result of deceit and deliberate action. So when elected officials claim that the effects of human industry on global climate are too uncertain or too hard to measure, when they ignore stable and widespread scientific consensus, they're using the same strategy that was used by tobacco companies beginning in the 1950s. Tobacco executives did everything they could to try and create an appearance of doubt around the link between smoking and cancer, despite mounting evidence. In other cases, ignorance results when knowledge is hidden behind structures of secrecy. So most knowledge about nuclear technology, for instance, about how to separate fissionable materials for reactors or bombs, about the circulation of nuclear fallout in ecosystems, has been considered sensitive military information and has been secret from the beginning. And some estimate that the amount of knowledge that's classified or closed off to most of us is 5 to 10 times greater than the knowledge that's freely available through libraries. Other times, ignorance results when we lose knowledge. And this has been one of the many negative outcomes of colonization. Knowledge that hasn't fit within a European framework has often been ignored and lost. In the 17th and 18th centuries, for instance, European naturalists traveled to the Caribbean looking for plants that they could bring back to use as medicines. But they only brought back plants whose properties fit within their priorities and their paradigms of health. So one glaring omission among the many new plants that they brought back to Europe were species that were used by women in the West Indies to induce abortions. And we have evidence that European naturalists absolutely learned about these plants and their use, but this knowledge didn't make it back to Europe. And there are many reasons for this to do with the political and cultural attitudes towards abortion in Europe. But it also seems likely that male naturalists were simply not interested in a plant that had no effect on their own bodies. So to take stock, we've seen ignorance created through deceit, through secrecy, and when particular kinds of knowledge haven't been valued. Ignorance also results when certain questions go unasked, or when research stops too soon. In my own work, one of the things that I look at are the creation of the first standards for safety for X-ray use in hospitals. In the 1930s, the National Bureau of Standards published a reassuring handbook on X-ray safety. And this included guidelines that showed doctors and technicians what thickness of lead they needed to stand behind in order to be safe from the X-rays. But it turns out that these comforting and precise numbers were hiding really what was no more than a best guess. There wasn't any good information at the time about the long-term effect of X-rays on bodies. But once the answer is codified and quantified, it looks settled. Numbers have the appearance of permanence, but they can hide deep uncertainty and ignorance just below the surface. And of course, funding plays a big role in this. If there isn't any money to support the continuation of a project or a particular kind of research, then many things will go unanswered. But I want to end with a consideration of another reason that things often go unmeasured. And this is a reason that's rooted in the question of who gets to participate in science. Science has traditionally excluded almost everyone, but a privileged few who have tended to be white and male. And if you focus on the exclusion of women for a moment, there are many examples that show how including women has combated ignorance in science. And I just have time for one. So as you may know, there was a widespread assumption in the late 19th century that women were by nature weak and unhealthy. So to be a woman was to be sick, basically all the time. And in 1878, a Harvard doctor and professor, Edward Clark, published a hugely influential book called Sex in Education, in which he argued that higher education was unhealthy for women, especially adolescent girls. Women's bodies and energies were already under great strain because of menstruation, and that expending energy on education would only make us weaker. It might actually disrupt our reproductive development and make us infertile. It turns out that this was not based on any evidence of any kind. As was pointed out a few years later by another doctor, Mary Putnam Jacoby, who decided to actually survey women about their experiences with menstruation. And she found that the majority of her respondents reported no significant suffering or discomfort. So what was needed in this case was someone to actually gather data about women, rather than resting on assumptions and widespread beliefs. So to conclude, I've offered a number of examples of different kinds of ignorance from the history of science. And I think each path towards not knowing requires a different kind of vigilance. Rejecting statements from politicians that misrepresent the state of scientific consensus, lobbying for funding for scientific research, but also doing everything we can to resist any narrative that belittles women, demonizes immigrants, criminalizes people of color, policies and language that actively work to disempower whole groups of people will result in a scientific community that is less diverse, where persistent underlying assumptions go unchallenged and particular questions go unasked. And this kind of ignorance is much harder to see. We're not going to have a before and after screenshot of a website to show us what is lost. We're just going to be left with a gaping hole, a shadow of knowledge that could have been, but isn't. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivien. Next speaker, Debra Mashek, is going to use a couple of slides.
I promise I won't do death by overhead. A couple of these. Does that work for you? Yeah. Is that okay? So I started, as I formulated my comments, started with what do I see as the role of a liberal arts education? I wanted to start with that question and came to this. The role of a liberal arts education is to cultivate the lifelong habits of both heart and mind that enable full and engaged, effective citizenship in both local and global communities. And then I asked myself, well, what's the role of a liberal arts education in politically divisive times, and decided it's exactly the same. But now, in order to undertake the work of the Academy, we need to do so while also navigating this toxic milieu of hostility, polarization, tribalism, distrust. And ultimately, and so building, I think, in part on Ambereen's point about when we ask questions, I also think a liberal arts education moves us in the direction of being able to solve the world's twistiest problems. I think we would be smart to entrust such a lofty task to individuals who are able to both identify and deploy the best ideas, regardless of the ideological bins from which those ideas happen to be drawn. Now, of course, in order for any of us to be able to do this, we have to have exposure to a range of ideas, right? We need to see what's out there. You can't possibly make use of tools you don't yet know exist. But mere exposure, I would argue, is insufficient. We also need to understand the nuances of those ideas deeply, authentically understand the ins and outs of how other people think, and critically we need to have practice engaging with others who really embrace those ideas, and we need to have practice engaging with others who facilely dismiss non-ordained viewpoints as somehow unworthy of consideration. But there is a problem, and so before I name that problem, I'm going to invite everyone to participate in a very brief demonstration. As always, you are welcome to participate or not. I'd like you to raise your hand if you identify as far left on the political spectrum. Left, middle of the road, right, far right. I suspect there are a number of very intertwined reasons why we don't see a lot of hands in the room today on the conservative side of the political spectrum. It could be that we just don't have the numbers here at Buzz, so those individuals aren't going to show up. Or it could be that we've got the numbers on campus, but that those individuals are perhaps not drawn to a panel with a title such as ours. Or maybe those individuals are in the room, but for some reason are either uncomfortable or unwilling to out themselves in this space at this time with those of us who are also here. Now, it turns out we have some data about the political orientations of people who are on campus. But before I show you those data, we're going to do a little thought exercise. Ask yourself, what percentage of Harvey Mudd students do you think likely identify as liberal or far left? So just come up with a number in your head. And now do the same thing for what percentage of Harvey Mudd students do you suspect identify as conservative or far right? You got a number in your head? Time for the reveal. What do the data say? Paul, would you mind if you say?
Yeah, just say Nancy.
Okay, so what we have here are data
from the freshman survey. All of our entering classes are invited to participate in this study. And what you can see is that over the past, from 2009 to 2017, that the self-identified political leanings of our entering classes have become increasingly liberal. And we see a corresponding decrease in those who identify as moderate or the left road, as well as those who identify as conservative or far right. As when Vivien, you were talking about this notion of, well, are these even the right questions to be asking about how these surveys are phrased? Has perhaps the meaning of the items changed over time? Those are perfectly valid questions. You should absolutely consider those. But given that this is the survey that's given to our freshmen, here's what we know. And now, if you look at just the students who are on campus right now, these are the data from our current freshmen, sophomores, juniors, and seniors. You see that the percentage of our students currently who identify as liberal or far left is around, we're right at 68%, and the percent on the other side, far right or conservative, we're around 7%. So we're seeing about a 9 to 1-ish split here. And next, please. And here are data. These are data from a national survey of faculty, so these are not just the Harvey Mudd faculty by any stretch, but national data. We see a similar liberalization of the faculty in higher ed over time. And this one goes from 89 to 2014, so we have a displacement of the time horizons that we're looking at. Okay, for advance, one more. Oh, wait, just kidding. Pretty fast, yeah. And now, before I go on and share with you my reaction to this, I'd like you just to check in with your own gut level. What is your response to this? Some might feel positively, kind of in the yay, we're winning idea. Some might feel negatively, perhaps in the range of, gosh, no wonder I feel like my perspective is not represented in my classroom. Either way, just ask yourself why you might be feeling what you're feeling. See if you can tap into that. And now I'll share my reaction. The academy, including our little slice of the academy here at Harvey Mudd, has become increasingly politically homogenous. And this worries me. Why? Because I think political homogeny here is a marker of dwindling viewpoint diversity. But why is that a problem? What's at stake for those in this room? Our faculty, our administrators, and especially our students. What do we miss out on when we attempt to learn and to teach in an ideological monoculture? When we don't hear these voices and engage seriously with their ideas, we miss the opportunity for our thinking to challenge and to be challenged. We don't get the chance to find out which ideas stand up within that crucible of open inquiry. We don't get the chance to have our own biases revealed. We don't get the chance for our own critical thinking skills to sharpen. And these missed opportunities mean that the lack of viewpoint diversity on campus undermines our ability to realize the very ideals of a liberal arts education. Instead, I worry that our learning spaces have become self-affirming echo chambers in which ideological validation displaces critical inquiry. Quoting Georgetown University law professor Nicholas Rosenkranz, when, quote, one side of the debate is dramatically underrepresented, or not represented at all, one result is, quote, a certain lack of rigor. To be blunt, he continues, a kind of intellectual laziness can set in when everyone agrees. And there's another problem, and one that I suspect will be deeply concerning to those of us in the room who value inclusivity. Think about this. Among us, every single day, in your clubs, in our dormitories, our classrooms, our departments, our committee meetings, our students, faculties, and staff who feel unwelcomed, silenced, and judged for seeing things differently than the campus majority. And anecdotal evidence from a lot of closed-door conversations I've had, not just over the past year, but over the past 5 years, I would say, suggests that these individuals don't feel comfortable bringing their viewpoints into the mix out of fear of being summarily dismissed, berated, or labeled as less than, or having their ideas simply said, like, those aren't worthy, we're not going to look at those. My question for the campus community is, are we okay with this? And for each of us as individuals, are you okay with this? Those of us interested in the well-being of students and in the broader impact of higher education, I think must take seriously the goal of creating campuses that welcome and celebrate viewpoint diversity. Our mission statement talks about making a positive impact on society. We want students to go out and change the world, to help address the world's most pressing problems. Yet, our successes will be less stellar if we don't provide the sort of learning experiences that will develop in students these habits of heart and mind that are necessary to understand diverse viewpoints, to consider, and yes, reconsider our own viewpoints, and to learn from others who see things differently. Said another way, viewpoint diversity enables us to realize the ideal of a liberal arts education in politically divisive times. Now, if you're wondering how to strengthen your own foundations for productive engagement with ideological diverse others, I would need at least another 7 minutes. So until then, I've prepared a handout that shares with you some of my favorite resources. If you have a chance to check out just one of these, I recommend the Open Mind program. It makes use of all of the other resources that are on the sheet. And if you could advance one more. I would like to thank those colleagues of mine who through careful conversation helped me clarify some of my own thinking on these issues, and thank you.
Thanks so much, Deb. Next we will hear from Salvador Pascencia.
So historically, creative writers have been sort of seen with suspicion by the Academy, and you will soon witness why that is. If we have the Trump Shakespeare, we also have the Trump form, which in a way is sort of a warped sonnet that is aphoristic, it is short, it is decontextualized, it is lacking in cohesion, and it is filtered through Twitter. And I sort of prepared this by my own sort of paper Twitter, so we'll have some of those features as well. So you've been warned. In 1968, J.G. Ballard's A New Wave Ballard, or Ballard. If you want to say it right, you say Ballard. In 1968, J.G. Ballard, a New Wave sci-fi writer, fabulous practitioner of speculative fiction, writes a short story where Ronald Reagan sits in the Oval Office as president. This is more than a decade before his nomination. And to paraphrase Ballard, America was destined to have a warm face saying incongruous things. So I'll make one ad hominem and say that our current president's face perfectly aligns with the things he is saying. Okay. We did not have this prophetic visionary to warn us, and I think part of us were still in disbelief. And in a way, it has sort of frustrated the fictive imagination. 100 miles south of here, there's this imaginary line that crawls out of the Pacific, scurries east, shoots angles to the bottom of 3 states, takes a horn, dives into the Rio Grande, zigzags through Matamoros and Brownsville, and then falls back into the ocean. This line, in some places, is also a structure. It is guarded. It has surveillance by puffy-eyed people on 16-hour shifts, and sometimes by mounted robotic necks. I have crossed this line in the early morning when there's still dew in the car. I've crossed in the middle of the night when the brake lights or become cataracts in your eyes. I have crossed it undocumented. I have crossed it documented. I have crossed it by flashing the laminate of my resident alien card, and I have crossed it as a naturalized citizen. I have declared corn cakes, a hard cheese my aunt air dries in a strawberry basket, bottles of undrinkable pulque I'm supposed to deliver to my relatives, on foot, in a bus, in a newly painted and upholstered Camry. I've crossed it sober, and I've crossed it on a heartbroken bender. But it is also an impossible psychic line, and it lately has been throbbing. When Mexico sends its people, they're not sending their best. They're not sending you. They're sending people that have lots of problems with us. They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assure you, are good people. I have waited in San Isidro McDonald's for uncles to arrive. In the parking lot, we dressed them in layers of stiff long-sleeve shirts. They went to work as trash men, washing the brine out of pickle buckets, scraping the muck and gravy from dishes. And then one day, Ronald Reagan anesthetized them. And from there, they were promoted to plant managers and route supervisors, to small business owners and landlords. In less than a generation, they went from a suited Adobe to a suited Adobe tied to a mule. That sounded better in my head. To an American Dream and homeowners association. Happy Cinco de Mayo. The best taco bowls are in Trump Tower Grill. I love Hispanics. So true, Jeb Bush is crazy. Who cares that he speaks Mexican? This is America. English. I share an alma mater with one of the most vilified and mocked American presidents, and I wanted to read you sort of an excerpt from one of the proclamations. One of America's great strengths is her diversity. A wide variety of peoples have made contributions to our nation. Each has added its own strength and charm to American life, and each provides an ongoing link between our culture and those of other countries around the world. The Hispanic culture is one to which this nation is particularly indebted. For centuries, men and women of Hispanic descent have provided distinguished leadership in our country and in the New World countries, both in government and other walks of life. Today, the people of the United States are reminded of this rich heritage in many ways. Millions of our citizens speak Spanish, and Hispanic names and traditions grace many parts of our landscapes. This country's Hispanic heritage is particularly important because it reminds us of the great traditions we share with our neighbors in Latin America. The Hispanic culture is one of depth, excitement, and beauty. It has crossed borders and mountains and oceans, and it has made its influence felt in all parts of the globe. Lost my turn, sorry. In honoring, we give strength to the international understanding which is indispensable to the world order. Now, therefore, I, Richard Nixon, President of the United States of America, do hereby proclaim the week beginning September 14, 1969, as National Hispanic Heritage Week. Build that wall. This line, this border, they will be fortified and strengthened with rebar and solar panels. You do not need to go to Calexico or the Paso or Nogales to see the wall or understand that it has been expanding. This wall keeps growing in the American imagination, in the imagination of the Americas and in the world. The wall, beyond its physical properties, is a metaphor. It is an architectural fantasy straight out of Escher, an impossible structure. And it is also a big, fat, beautiful wall that has already been built. Thank you.
I'm going to shake it up and remain seated.
Sounds great. I'll give you some light blowing in.
Mostly because I want to, but also because I have a prop. And I think you might be able to see it a little bit better down here. So I am a cultural geographer, which means I have been trained to pay attention to how people do or don't form community through space. And so what I'm going to invite us to do is think about the kind of space that a lot of folks have been preoccupied with since the election and even in the run-up to it, which is largely the space of the nation state. What do I mean by the nation state? The state is, a sort of, I'm thinking about a federal, agglomeration of institutions and agencies that requires legitimation in order to act in particular ways, in order to tax, in order to engage in public policy and regulate and so forth. And so the federal state as an actor, in order to legitimate itself, in order for us to all go along with this idea of the United States and to pay our taxes and participate in U.S. society, mobilizes the idea of a nation, right? Often referred to colloquially as America, even though there are many Americas, that makes a certain set of promises around rights, responsibility, redistribution, sympathy, belonging, and so forth. So this preoccupation with the nation state is understandable, given its power, given the amount of violence that has sort of come to bear on particular populations with particular prominence lately, although that violence is certainly not new, as Sal pointed out. But what I want to do as a geographer is to invite us to think about the other geographical scales at which people experience citizenship and belonging or exclusion, and also to think about those, how those scales might provide departure points for critical confrontations with nation-state power, not just under the current administration, but sort of in the long haul. So I'm going to talk about two articles that I actually just taught a couple of weeks ago in my course this term, because I think that they provide some insight for us into thinking about the idea of geographical scale that might help to open up how we think about politics in the current moment. So the first of those is by Neil Smith, who was probably until his death in 2012, the first or second most famous and most widely cited living human geographer. He wrote an article in 1992 called Contours of Spatialized Politics. And in that piece, he introduces the idea of scale. So for Smith, scale describes the profoundly political social processes through which types of place are differentiated from one another hierarchically. So I'll say that again because it's a lot of words. The profoundly political social processes through which types of place are differentiated from one another hierarchically. And the metaphor that he used to think about scale was Russian dolls. So you have the idea of the globe. I am going to make noise, so if you want to rustle your plastic, I won't hear it. You have the nation state. You have the city. This is like why I got a PhD, so I could play with dolls and Come on. The community, which is perhaps the most nebulous scale that Smith talks about. You have the home, and lastly you have the body. So Smith's argument is that spatial scales aren't necessarily opposed to one another or disconnected from one another, but the discourse of scale, this hierarchical idea of big places and small places, makes them seem that way. In ways that can make smaller geographical scales seem trivial, apolitical, irrelevant, or disconnected. So the sort of feminist model of the personal is political, which has of course been taken up by anti-racist and queer and labor movements as well, is a way of sort of pointing out what is imbued with power about the sort of scale of the body and the home, and not natural, not trivial, and shouldn't be sort of out of sight, out of mind. So one of Smith's insights is that we spend so much time talking about historical eras and epochs and figuring out how to divide up space, divide up time. You know, what does it mean that we're in the age of Trump, right? There's a sort of temporal reference even in the premise of this talk. But we have comparatively little language for thinking about the terms on which types of space are divided from one another. And thinking about space in that way might be important, Smith argues, because struggles over spaces and struggles that play out in everyday life are political, but they need to be understood with more rigor. Spaces, you know, often, especially on campuses, we talk about whether or not spaces are safe. But the idea of a space as safe or unsafe isn't just a metaphor. There's a materiality to it that's both physical and social and involves a particular set of practices. I mean, the space of campus itself is produced by, the labor of a wide range of different types of worker, the sort of consumptive and educative labor of students, all of the logistical networks that provide us with food, the infrastructure that provides us with power and water. Like there is a materiality to this space that is both social and physical, as a sort of node of labor capital infrastructure, policing, etc. So Smith differentiates these types of space, but then, and this is the part where Smith becomes more explicit about his own political point of view as a leftist. But I think that the lesson is probably applicable to different movements, and you can see examples of how different movements and different sort of ideological forces have mobilized the same idea over time. He calls on the left to be a little more critical about this motto of think global, act local, and to ask what would it mean to act local, but also act globally too. So he calls on the movements that he's part of to scale up, to move up the scalar hierarchy. And the scalar hierarchy, of course, is often the purview of people with relative, social mobility, people who are relatively elite. But he argues that all movements, wherever they are, need to think about how to sort of build power and jump scale. And so we might think about some contemporary examples of that, some contemporary local spaces in which the promise of citizenship is actually sort of distributed out of sync with what the nation state is doing. So certainly the sanctuary city movement, or the way that local state actors have pushed for a more robust and capacious enfranchisement of undocumented people than as the nation state might proffer one example. And I think I'll end there. But I'll end by very briefly referencing one other geographer who builds on Smith, Engin Eisen, who he argues that we can't think about the city and the state as the same kind of place, and that the nation, he argues, the nation state in particular, it's based on an abstraction, right? It mobilizes this abstract idea of America, and then that informs how we all sort of produce and reproduce that idea in our everyday lives. We do it when we vote, we do it when we chat, we do it when we pay taxes, we do it when we hang out. But he argues that the city has a particular materiality to it that actually makes it the building block of the state. And if you think about it, it kind of makes sense in terms of the largest economic actors that make up the space called the United States of America. I mean, think about this region alone, right? Like how much of the goods that produce this idea of the American economy are actually shipped through Long Beach, San Diego, and LA. It's through sort of the spatial logic of the city, whether it's in ports, whether it's in military bases, or whether it's the economic networks that are so focused on cities, that actually produce and give material form to the nation state. And so I point this out not to advocate Calexit by any means, but just to invite curiosity and then sort of a shift in our vision about how ordinary people might organize politically, specifically through the urban scale, in ways that don't let violent forms of nation-state power or capitalist exploitation have the last word on how the economy or how everyday life are structured. Whether you share like my political stakes or Smith's political stakes, I think the idea of attending to the local and thinking about how it connects to your broader ideology or your broader movement is one that might sort of open up this very understandable, but in some ways, I don't want to say excessive because I understand where it's coming from, but I think we almost always scale politics at the nation state to our own detriment as political actors, whatever our political ideologies. And so I wonder how attention to scale might open up conversations about politics and help us to have them differently. So thanks, I'll end there.
Thank you, David. I'll share, let's see, the time being 12:51 today, so we've done a pretty good job, and I actually tasked a close friend of mine with keeping me on time, so the consequences will be swift and immediate. So I'd like to focus from a political science perspective on the question of how social change works. So I've spent the last 25 years trying to understand the answer to that question. And the analytic lens for this concept for this question is the concept of institutions. And when social scientists use the term institutions, we're referring to the rules that underpin our society. And there's no concept in all of the social sciences over the last 100 years that has received more attention than the concept of institutions. Culture maybe competes with it, but the general public has never heard of the idea. So institutions are rules. And these include the US Constitution, which was intended to make the United States dictator-proof. That was its intent. So spread power out across the branches of government, give states a lot of power. It's much, much, much more spread out than almost any other country in the world. So when Donald Trump pulls the United States out of the climate treaty, the push for alternative energy does not stop there because California is allowed to make its own climate policy. That is almost unheard of in any other country in the world. And so this speaks very much to David's point about nation states and their design. We have our own climate policy that was put in place by former Republican Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger. But institutions also include smaller, much more everyday rules. So food regulations, why can we trust the stuff that we're eating out of these noisy plastic wrappers today? Because of an elaborate set of codes regarding food regulations. The varnish on the wood under your feet is emitting no cancer-causing chemicals, but many fewer than was the case in the lecture hall 30 years ago on this campus because of rules coming out of the state of California. The thickness of the letters on the exit sign to this room are part of the life safety code decided by hundreds and hundreds of engineers and firefighters and architects who meet in annual meetings to decide such things, as well as the location of the exits. The building itself was crafted according to the rules of LEED certification, as many of you know, a private rulemaking body that says if you want our certification, you have to follow these rules, and then those rules actually become embodied in the state as different cities and states say, you have to be LEED certified if you want to operate in our jurisdiction. The clothes on our backs are affected by rules governing trade agreements and which countries can export, which ones don't. I doubt there are many Cuban textiles in the room, maybe increasingly so. Our cell phones are governed by over 200,000 rules in the form of the patents that were required to bring that technology to market. Gender normative hairstyles, social norms. How long did you hold that door open for the person behind you? Is 20 feet enough that you can sort of turn with a smile the other way? The composition of your blood. You have less lead in your blood today than was the case for an event like this 30 years ago because of rules for pulling lead out of gasoline. The language we're speaking, why is it English anyway? When rules are working really well, you don't even notice that there's a rule there, right? It's just the way things are. Contracts with custodial staff, with the lighting company and so forth. Together, all of these rules make up an enormous interlocking machine. I would call it the world's largest machine. They're embedded, they're operating around the clock 24/7, and these are what shape what we do and how we do it. Where we go, when we go there. It's this strange sort of quasi-invisible set of strings. On Thursdays, a couple times per month, you'll see it's like some strange cast a spell Android film or something. Faculty will be in offices and riding bikes and doing all things in different directions, and then strangely at 11 o'clock we just start moving in the same direction toward the all-campus faculty meeting, and you'll see them streaming. Strange, it's a great time to get forms signed, by the way. So these things are in the background the whole time. And so if you want to change the world, you have to change the rules, to institutionalize new practices. And this requires designing for the long haul, for a resilient new pattern. In other words, social change requires a measure of stability. The concept of meaningful social change holds within it an idea of stability. We don't just want marriage equality for a week, right? We don't want clean water or healthy forests for a year. We have to embed new patterns into the contracts and the city codes and the laws and the standards and the building practices and the urban plans and the very fabric of society. That is how you get change. But what does this mean in practice? If we're focusing on new rules, isn't this just some massive out-of-control process of bureaucratization, creating a bunch of red tape? I would submit that it is not. That the rules are already there, humming 24/7, and no one makes more rules than the private sector. So don't believe that it's capitalism versus regulation. Capitalism is a form of regulation. It is impossible. Imagine running a multinational corporation without all of these contracts and standards and so forth to get goods and services exchanged with total strangers and to be able to rely on receiving the money on time. So the rules are already there. It's a matter of which rules we have and who decides. And that question of who gets to make the rules is itself governed by rules. I call them super rules, right? Who gets to vote? Who gets to participate? Who gets to be at the meeting? So if I were hypothetically a student interested in social change, and if I hypothetically was concerned about change not only in my society writ large, but at my college, I would pay really close attention to the rules governing that college, in particular the participation rules, and who gets to decide things like, hypothetically, budget priorities. I would like to end by just emphasizing a particular point, which goes back to something that Debra Mashek was talking about with respect to viewpoint diversity. 1 minute, and you're not buying the next round of beers next time, I'll be fine. Which has to do with viewpoint diversity. The concept of free speech was not supposed to be in the U.S. Constitution. All right, when the U.S. Constitution was being written and the Federalists were saying, you know what, it doesn't make a lot of sense to have these small states with very small central powers. We're just going to get wiped out by the British. At some point, the French will get tired of rescuing us. And so we made this country, and there was a big debate over the form of the U.S. Constitution, and the people who were against the formation of the United States, the Anti-Federalists. If you read anything, read the Federalist Papers on this stuff. The Anti-Federalists, who did not want a powerful national government like we have today, said, well, we need to include some amendments here, including there should be a guaranteed right to free speech. And the Federalists said, that's ridiculous. As soon as we start enumerating what rights people have, the implication will be whatever we didn't put in the document they don't have, right? Like it was a legit debate on either side. But it was the people who were against the formation of the United States today that were responsible for the fact that we have the right to free speech in the U.S. Constitution. So this is just to reinforce the point that it's precisely this sort of dialogue through which we build a collective intelligence and intelligent form of action that's better than any of us could come up with on our own. Thank you. So with that, certainly, if anybody has to take off, it's not rude when you have to, but we hope that we have time for at least 15 minutes of questions, comments, conversation. I'll just call on you. You can direct it to a particular speaker. If you don't remember their name, just say, hey, you made a point I agreed with or not. And so we invite your comments. Let's take just a minute for anybody who has to take off right now, and then hopefully those who can stay, let's continue the conversation.
I'm going to stack these handouts over here in case anyone would like to grab one on their way out.
All right. So with that, any questions or comments to any of the speakers? Yes, please.
So I have a question about the geography. So you mentioned kind of the intermediate level between nation state and community as the city. And I'm curious as to how that analysis can be generalized, because one of the things that I saw in this last election cycle, especially in polling, was a focus, and perhaps over-focus on urban communities at the expense of an analysis and focus of rural or extra-urban.
That's a great question, and I think this is like part of where it's interesting to refer to Smith's writing, which I'm happy to share. Because community is such a nebulous term, right? Sometimes it is synonymous with neighborhood, but community can also refer to like particular interest groups or like particular classes. So I was just visiting a friend that I went to college with, and we were talking about the relationship between like liberal arts colleges and gentrification. And she and I are from about the same economic background. This wasn't like a diss, but she used a term that I'd never heard before, which was the white transplant class. Like to think about the way that communities are networked across, suburban spaces where people, in a certain social position often grow up, and then the spaces that they find themselves able to afford when they move to cities. So I think community is quite hard to pin down. I think the question of whether the focus was like too rural or too urban or too suburban is like one that like people probably disagree about based on their own like political preoccupations and like it's important to remember that we do live in a what Kathy Caruso would call a wound culture, in which like nobody feels like their pain has been heard. So like I don't think I have a particular position on the question of over or under emphasis. I think one interesting question would be to look at like where voter participation was down, and I don't have the numbers on that to be able to give you an answer.
Terrific. Other questions or comments?
I have a question for Prof. Mashek. You spoke a lot about the shift in political ideology on college campuses and in faculties, but there are political ideologies present in this country that influenced this last election that would not be acceptable on this college campus, that the administration specifically does not allow, that are playing out on a national scale right now. So who draws those lines about what should be, what ideological diversity should be encouraged at college campuses and what should be suppressed?
I think that's such a great question, and for me, I'm thinking right away of what Paul Steinberg was talking about, like who's invited in to be part of the decision making. And so the answer of who, I would say, is all of us, that we as a community need to think about the values and not just about freedom of speech, because it's one value. Inclusivity is another value. Truth finding, to the notion, to the idea, except that truth exists or not, is another value. And so for me, it's really about thinking about the community taking responsibility for, A, having those conversations. One of the concerns I have is that I don't think we're talking enough about it. But B, once we've had the conversations and it's our turn to invite the speaker in, right? Let's don't invite the provocateur. Let's invite the person who's actually giving us some critical, conceptual thinking stuff to chew on to help push against to allow us a chance to investigate our own biases, our own ideologies. Because there maybe we as a community say, you know what, yeah, let's don't invite in the KKK. Because maybe that is so out of alignment with our values, and it's not going to be pushing our thinking in a way, so that's maybe not an invitation we choose to make. But maybe we choose to bring in someone who's talking about the economic impacts of climate change and thinking about, well, gosh, how do you without saying we should just regulate everything, but what are the consequences of that regulation for this group of people or these small business owners, and how could we equalize the impact? And those sorts of things I think are incredibly worthy, and by having those conversations, my own thinking and understanding will absolutely sharpen, and that's to me what excites me about viewpoint diversity.
Excellent. Any thoughts, questions?
One of the things I really enjoyed about your talk was that you kind of challenged the notion of like studying the production of knowledge and flipped it on its end. But one of the things I was wondering is that there's often kind of like a lag or a lack of communication between the academy and the public sphere. And so studying the production of ignorance is important. But then I think some people would ask, well, how does that help combat the production of ignorance now? And I understand that like studying in the academy is important for historical knowledge and being able to look back on it, but how do you think you can bridge that gap between studying it and then actually making a change?
Yeah, this is always the hard question for the historian. I'm offering you understanding and contemplation, and now someone else is going to take it up and hopefully come up with excellent strategies for policy and action. Though, I think when you're thinking about this question of the gap, it's certainly a gap between the kind of, humanistic inquiry we do in universities and then the wider public. But thinking about also just the product of scientific research, I think there's a gap there, which is a kind of ignorance that I didn't really speak about, or something that, and this is why I think a kind of taxonomy of ignorance can be really helpful for thinking about what the next move would be. So if we've identified that there's a really significant gap between what scientists are talking about and the general conversation about science happening outside of these walls, then we can point to that and we can start to study it and think about what kind of strategies for increasing participation in science, for creating effective science communication. So I don't know that I have a perfect example or answer, but I do think I think the first step really is identifying exactly what are we looking at before we can then decide on some kind of action that will try and help mitigate the problem.
I could just piggyback onto that and also say this is why interdisciplinarity is so important. So to be able to have that historical lens and think about what are the tools of policy change and how's that going to translate for different communities at different times, that's incredibly exciting. That is what we are about at a liberal arts institution. And so facilitating those conversations, that's how we're going to solve the world's twistiest problems.
I had an experience like this recently. A very close friend of mine who is a local self-made millionaire who was raised in what sounds like pretty extreme poverty, white male. He's my conservative friend, right? You know, so we're always economically conservative, not culturally. We'd have these debates, and I could never seem to knock him off of the notion that people in poverty didn't put themselves there. Because he pulled himself out of a community where he's allowed to talk about the sort of methodologies that keep his other family members in poverty and so forth. And they all want something from him now, and this and that. And I could never really get him to a place of compassion. And then, fast forward years later, and I'd stopped trying in our debates. I moved on to different things. Fast forward, he saw a film. I wish I could remember the name of it offhand. It was a profile of poverty in the UK. And he comes to me, and he's talking about this film and everything, and the struggles that this family had day in and day out and on the edge, and just when they started to get ahead, they would get knocked back and they didn't have health care. And he's like articulating better than I ever could over the past several years about all these issues, not realizing this is what I was trying in my lame way to convey with my statistics or what have you. And that was a case where somehow the arts, and I'm thinking here to Sal's presentation and the sort of evocative imagery and the impact that that has on me, you know, pairing that with something like with what Debra Mashek was presenting, somehow it was the arts that actually hit him between the eyes in ways that I wasn't able to do from political science. Other questions or comments on this or related topics? Yes, please.
This is more of a thought I had. I was reading recently about, I think it was a social psychologist who wrote concept of thresholding, so how people in a mob behave differently as they were as individuals, and earlier it was considered part of the mob mentality, you just behave differently, and then it was explained, and then he made a point that though, if certain amount of people start behaving differently, you will also join the act essentially, and each person has a different threshold. So I wanted to relate that to the ignorance point and how you pointed out that the EPA just removed climate change from their website. So is that, we think, trying to get more people to now increase the threshold, so to speak, like get more and more people to believe that, you know, climate change is a rumor, and do you think this is a very powerful step in that thresholding concept, or is it not related? Or
well, I'll ask Deb about the threshold concept. I'm not sure, but I mean, I think it's a powerful tool, though, and it just anytime an institution with power, like a government agency, stops providing information, I think that is absolutely going to have a powerful effect.
Yeah, and I haven't heard that term before, but it certainly resonates with the idea that we are social creatures, that we are tribal, that we've developed some deep software in terms of how to function in groups, and the idea that I need to do basically what other people are doing so I'm not ostracized makes sense, and so I think it's part of why things go viral, and they said that we can use that for social change and to create positive impacts. Maybe I would say, yeah, we should totally hack our software in a way to make that change for ignorance, for all sorts of positive outcomes.
If I may, Shakespeare does offer an answer to this mob, as Julius Caesar. When the mob turns against the conspirators, they go off searching for them because they're going to kill them. They meet a man whose name is Cinna, and he's Cinna the poet, not Cinna the conspirator, and they have a little debate, and he's like, I'm Cinna the poet, I'm not the conspirator, and they're like, we're going to kill you anyway, right? We are already at this point where we just want action, and we've all been convinced that this is the right way to act, and there's no reason anymore, right? There's just sort of, let's follow what we've decided to do, even though we have evidence that this thing that we're going to do is not the right thing, we're going to do it anyway.
On this concept of mob rule, Reinhold Niebuhr, our essentially as a class teacher. Reinhold Niebuhr has a book called Moral Man and Moral Society, which is arguing that persuasion can only go so far in bringing about social justice because groups do not think the same way that individuals do. Power in an economic class and the racial hierarchy can be so embedded that persuasion loses its force, and that sometimes you have to, in this words, raise power against power. Now, this was a person studied very closely by Martin Luther King in his own sort of intellectual development, thinking about how to move past the idea of passive resistance towards some sort of ethical resistance. In my critique of Reinhold Niebuhr on this front is Niebuhr says it all comes down to the ethical use of power, and you have to convince others that your coercion, your form of coercion, whether it's massive disobedience or what have you, is in fact justified, but that required convincing people with ideas. And so even to define the ethical use of coercion itself seems to me to require some sort of democratic dialogue.
The question of the mob mentality also makes me think about Freud and his writing on psychology. And I think this is part of why I think I get a little bit leery of conversations about politics. As someone who's like a nerd and has been thinking about race and gender and sexuality in class like for a long time, you'd like to see suddenly everyone get interested in it now, but only at the scale of the nation state. Like there's a particular kind of melancholy to that I think a lot of people feel in different ways. But one of Freud's points is that, in mass psychology and the analysis of the ego, he argues that there's this sort of band of this fraternal bond that forms in mob mentality in which people kill and eat and then worship the memory of their leaders. And so part of what bores me about like, oh, what did Trump do today, or like, what did he tweet, or what's Melania wearing, is that even for people who consider themselves far left and critics of that, it's still buying into a sort of spectacle that I think is actually not totally divorced from worship. And so in that way, I think we sort of sustain, whether you love Trump or hate him, you sustain sort of psychic complicity in this relationship to the leader that sort of eschews attention to like what you could be doing as a political actor in like the immediate spaces through which you move, in accordance with whatever your values are.
Fantastic. Well, with that, let me thank our audience and participants.